Imagine this. You're dragged from your home in the dead of night. Your children forced to watch as you're publicly shamed. Naked, humiliated, stones and insults thrown at you from every direction. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. It's a reality from medieval Europe, a society where justice wasn't blind, but brutal, theatrical, and designed to instill terror into the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. And what was your crime? A whispered rumor, a betrayal in the eyes of your husband, or maybe just a slight accusation of infidelity. No trial, no evidence, just suspicion, and your neighbors, your friends, transformed into executioners. It's a spectacle designed to break not just the body, but the mind. But that's only the beginning. The true horrors of medieval justice are about to be revealed, and trust me, they will haunt you long after you've watched. If you thought the worst was behind us, think again. What you're about to hear was designed not just to punish, but to destroy, to leave scars on the soul that lasted a lifetime. Let's start with what was considered mercy. Imagine being paraded through your own streets, children watching, neighbors jeering. They called it the penance walk, but in reality, it was a carefully calculated psychological weapon. The first part of this public humiliation, the shaving. Yes, the shaving. Before anyone even laid a hand on you, your hair, your crown, your identity was torn away. Think about it. Hair was everything in medieval Europe. A woman's hair was her pride, her identity. It symbolized purity, modesty, even marital status. So, what does it mean when your hair is ripped away in front of everyone you've ever known? It's more than humiliation. It's a deliberate erasure of who you are. Imagine being shaved in such a way that you weren't just bald, but made to look monstrous, diseased. That's how they wanted you to appear. This wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was psychological warfare. Every snip of the blade was meant to strip you of your humanity, to make you a walking symbol of disgrace. And the crowd? They were encouraged to laugh, to jeer, to enjoy every moment of your suffering. What's worse, it wasn't enough for them to just watch. They were forced to. If they didn't come to witness your public execution, they were fined, forced to be complicit. But the cruelty didn't end there. The next step was to strip you down, not just of your clothes, but of any remaining shred of dignity. Some women were left in nothing but a thin shift, essentially a nightgown, while others were completely naked. It wasn't just shameful, it was spiritually contaminating. To see a woman stripped bare in public was considered a curse, a sign of the woman's fall from grace. As you re-drag through the streets, you not just walking. You walking through the very places that once defined you. Your house, your church, the market where you once bought bread, the homes of neighbors you had known your entire life. And with each step, the crowd grows. The stones get heavier. The taunts get louder. And if you're still watching, you're not alone. You're complicit too. But there's something even more chilling about this entire ordeal. The people who performed these punishments weren't evil masterminds. They weren't sadistic monsters. They were the very fabric of the community. Priests, lawmakers, and even your neighbors believed they were doing God's work. This wasn't a barbaric act of vengeance. It was justified as divine justice. So, how far would the medieval justice system go to ensure this system worked? Well, let me take you deeper into the darkness of the medieval mind. Stay with me, because this is just the beginning. So, what happens when humiliation isn't enough? What if the punishment went beyond just psychological terror? What if it was a test of your very soul? I'll reveal the shocking truth in the next part. If you want to see what's coming, stay with me. Now that we've seen the psychological torture of public humiliation, let's move deeper into the twisted world of medieval justice. What happens when the rumors, the whispers, and the shame aren't enough to prove your guilt? What happens when society, driven by fear and religious fervor, demands more, much more? Welcome to the trial by ordeal. You might have heard of it, but what you don't know is just how horrifyingly real and common it was. It wasn't just a medieval superstition. It was a twisted form of justice that operated with the belief that God himself would intervene to reveal the guilty from the innocent. And that meant that the most horrific forms of punishment were justified as righteous acts of divine intervention. Let's talk about the trial by cold water. The name sounds innocuous enough, doesn't it? But in reality, it was nothing short of a death sentence in disguise. Picture this: a woman accused of adultery, stripped down to her shift, bound in a specific position, her thumb tied to her big toe, her body twisted in ways that would make swimming impossible. Her fate? Decided by the water. But this wasn't just any water. No, this was blessed by a priest. It was pure, holy water, the very same water used in baptism to cleanse the soul. The idea was that if the woman was truly innocent, the water would accept her. She would float. If she was guilty, the water would reject her, causing her to sink, perhaps drown. God, in their minds, was the ultimate judge. Her fate lay in his hands. But here's the catch. She wasn't just judged by God. She was judged by the very water that was meant to cleanse sin. It wasn't a fair test. It was a deadly gamble. Can you even imagine the psychological torment? You're accused of a crime, your fate sealed not by evidence, but by whether or not you float in a pool of blessed water. Either way, you lose. If you float, you're guilty, and you'll be executed right there. If you sink, you're innocent, but you might drown before they even pull you out. One case in England from 1194 describes a woman named Edith who was accused of infidelity. She was thrown into the water, bound up like a sack of flesh. She sank. She was pulled out almost dead, but still deemed innocent by God's judgment. The horror? She was left with brain damage from the lack of oxygen and died 3 days later. That's the tragic reality of trial by ordeal. No matter the outcome, the woman loses. Either she dies, or she's left with permanent damage, spiritual, physical, and psychological. And it gets worse. Let me introduce you to another horrifying ordeal: the trial by hot iron. Imagine this. You're forced to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a certain number of paces. The law is clear. If the burn heals cleanly, you're innocent. If it gets infected, you're guilty. The result? Often a painful death from the infections that inevitably followed, since medieval medicine didn't know how to treat wounds, let alone manage sepsis. It wasn't about justice. It was about spectacle. It was about forcing the accused to endure unimaginable pain and suffering in front of a crowd that was legally compelled to witness it. And here's the sickening truth. This wasn't considered barbarism. No, it was considered God's judgment. A punishment meted out by the divine, and if you survived, it was a sign of your righteousness. If you died, well, that was simply the will of God. But what about those who didn't face the physical agony of these trials? Well, their punishment wasn't any better. In some regions, the accused would be branded with hot irons, often with the letter A for adulterer. But the worst? The women who were locked away in perpetual isolation, erased from society, their names stripped from history. You think that these ordeals couldn't get any worse? Wait until you hear about the punishment that was far worse than death itself, the kind of punishment that ensured women were erased from society forever. If you want to know what happened to those who survived the trials and returned to a life of living death, stay with me. It's coming up next. You've seen the torturous trials, the fiery iron, and the blessed water. But what happens when you survive the ordeal? What if the worst punishment isn't death, but life? A life in which you are not only condemned but erased, buried in a tomb of stone and silence. This was the fate for some of medieval Europe's most high-profile accused, and it was far worse than any execution. This was a punishment so cruel it left the condemned living, but with no chance of ever truly living again. Welcome to the reality of perpetual enclosure. Imagine being locked away in a small, suffocating chamber. No windows, no light, no human contact. Just the slow, grinding passage of time. Your only company, the echoes of your own thoughts as they become distorted, twisted by the isolation. A life spent in complete darkness, with only the rhythmic delivery of food as your reminder that you're still breathing. In 1314, the infamous Tour d'Eslay affair scandalized the French court. Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy, two noble women accused of adultery, were sentenced to live in solitary confinement. No death sentence, no dramatic execution, just a slow, agonizing life in a tiny, stone chamber. Margaret was locked in a room no larger than 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were thick stone, and the only window was so high and narrow that it was impossible to escape through it. The door? Sealed with iron, with only a small opening at the bottom through which food was passed once a day. And here's the true horror. No human contact. No news. No letters. No books. Nothing. Just the sound of the guard's footsteps delivering your meals and the changing light outside to mark the passage of time. And Margaret didn't die in a week, a month, or even a year. She spent 8 years in that chamber, alone, isolated, forgotten by the world. It wasn't just physical isolation. It was psychological torture. The human mind wasn't designed for this kind of confinement. Margaret's isolation slowly crushed her spirit, and by the time she died in her cell at just 30 years old, the chronicles simply say she died of natural causes. But what really killed her was the suffocating loneliness, the lack of stimulation, the endless days of staring at the same stone walls. Her body gave up long before her mind did. But Margaret wasn't alone. Blanche, her counterpart, endured a similar fate, spending 11 years locked away in her own chamber. Eventually, she was moved to a convent, but even there, she remained in isolation for the rest of her life. 11 years in a dark room, completely cut off from the world. A life that stretched far longer than her brief years of freedom. These women were not simply imprisoned. They were erased from history, their names struck from family records, their existence hidden away in stone walls, as though they had never been born. But what about the women who weren't nobility? Those who weren't as protected by their status and wealth? Their isolation was far worse. In some regions of Europe, a practice called immurement was used, a fate even more disturbing than anything you can imagine. A woman convicted of adultery might be sentenced to live out her days in a tiny, suffocating cell, often built into the very walls of a city. A cell so small she couldn't stand up fully, a cell so cramped she could barely move. And once she was inside, the entrance would be bricked up, the opening would be sealed, leaving only a small hole to pass food and waste. She would die there, alone, suffocated by the very walls that held her. One case in 1357 describes a woman in Barcelona named Maria, convicted of adultery. She was sentenced to be immured in a cell built into the city wall. The chronicler says her screams could be heard for months, until they finally stopped. 9 years later, when the cell was opened to remove her body, the walls were covered in her desperate scratching, messages of prayer, curses, pleas for mercy. The woman had clawed at the stone with her fingernails, wearing them down to bloody stumps. But there was no mercy. There was no salvation. Just silence. And that silence? It was by design. The psychological toll of such isolation is unimaginable. Today, solitary confinement for more than 15 days is considered torture by human rights organizations. But these women endured months, years, even decades. And the worst part? It was considered merciful. The priests and judges believed they were offering the woman a chance to repent, a chance to find redemption before death. But what they didn't understand was that they were turning a woman's life into an endless, suffocating hell. And this wasn't just a punishment for common women. Even noble women were subjected to it. What makes this even more terrifying is that this type of isolation wasn't just about punishment. It was a means of erasure. These women didn't just disappear from society. They disappeared from history. They were forgotten. Their names, their lives, even their suffering wiped clean from the records, as though they never existed. But if you think that the horrors ended there, you're wrong. There was one final punishment that was designed not just to mark the body, but to make the suffering permanent, so everyone would know exactly what you did. It was a punishment that would stay with you for life. If you want to know how the system of medieval justice left its mark, stay with me. This next part will shock you even more. Now that you've seen the torture of isolation, the psychological degradation, and the sheer cruelty of medieval justice, let me show you the punishment that went beyond just physical pain. This wasn't just about punishing the woman. It was about making sure everyone knew what she had done. This was the punishment that would follow her for life, marking her as a walking warning to others. You've heard the term branding before, but you've never heard it in this context. This wasn't just a physical mark, it was social branding, a permanent reminder of what you were accused of. If you think the trial by ordeal was bad, the consequences of being branded or mutilated were even more severe. In 11th century England, under the law of King Nut, a woman found guilty of adultery was to have her nose and ears cut off. This wasn't a punishment you could simply recover from. The laws didn't say, perhaps she should be punished. No, it said, an adulteress shall have her nose and ears cut off, not as an alternative to other punishment, as the standard punishment. Think about that. This wasn't a choice, it was a law. A woman's nose and ears removed in front of the crowd, a clear, unmistakable signal that she was guilty. A piece of living propaganda, her body used to teach a lesson. The process was horrific. A blacksmith or a barber, people skilled with sharp blades, would cut her nose off first. No anesthetic, no painkillers, just raw, excruciating pain. The blood flowed freely, staining the stone streets. But that wasn't the worst of it. Once the nose was gone, they'd move on to the ears, slicing them off one by one. The screams of the woman echoed through the streets as the crowd watched. For them, it was entertainment. For her, it was the end of her life as she knew it. But here's the sick irony. These mutilations weren't just about punishment. They were about visibility. The woman couldn't hide. She couldn't go to another town and start a new life. Her mutilation was her brand. The missing nose, the ears, everyone knew what she had done. It followed her. It haunted her. One particular case in 1231 in a German town describes a woman named Gertrude, accused by her husband of adultery with a traveling merchant. There was no real proof, just suspicion and a single neighbor's testimony. Yet, under the law, that was enough. Gertrude was brought before the public, her fate sealed. Her nose and ears were cut off in front of the entire town. And then, just to make sure the punishment was complete, her children, her own children, were forced to watch. But what happened to Gertrude didn't end with the mutilation. She was divorced by her husband. Her face, the most intimate part of her identity, was destroyed. No one would hire her. No one would take her in. She couldn't beg because her mutilated appearance scared people away. Within 6 months, she was found dead in a ditch, her body abandoned. No one cared. No one was responsible. The mark of her crime was her death. But the branding didn't stop with just the cutting of ears and noses. In some parts of medieval Europe, women were branded with hot irons. The mark was usually an A for adulteress, pressed into her forehead or cheek. It didn't just mark the body, it marked the soul. Once branded, a woman couldn't hide her crime. She was a living, walking example of punishment, her identity stripped away with every cruel blow. The most chilling part of this system? It worked. The law was a tool to instill fear. The entire village was meant to see her suffering, to understand the consequences of betraying the patriarchal system. And that fear was exactly what the authorities wanted. They weren't just punishing the guilty, they were terrorizing everyone. What's even more disturbing is the medical reality behind these punishments. The cuts, the burns, the permanent damage to the body, they weren't just painful. They led to infections, death. Medieval hygiene wasn't advanced enough to prevent what happened next. fever, sepsis, and slow, agonizing deaths. And the law? It didn't care. As long as the woman suffered, it was considered justice. But there's a twist. The men who played a role in carrying out these punishments, they often had their own secrets. In fact, many of the men who condemned these women, the priests, the judges, and even the executioners, were revealed to have committed adultery themselves. The hypocrisy was staggering. These men, often guilty of the very crime they were punishing, went unpunished. They were allowed to carry on, while women like Gertrude were branded, mutilated, and cast aside. And here's where the double standard truly hits. In some cases, the men involved in the adulterous relationships, the ones who actually cheated, weren't subjected to these brutal punishments. They might pay a fine, maybe face public penance, but in most cases, that was it. Men could even fight in trial by combat if they were accused, something women could never do. Now that you've seen how far the system went to humiliate and destroy women, you might be wondering, what happened to those men who didn't suffer any real consequences? How did medieval justice treat them? And most importantly, how did this entire system perpetuate for centuries? The answer is more disturbing than you can imagine. Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll dive into the horrific double standards of medieval justice and the real reasons why women were punished far worse than men. You won't believe what I'm about to reveal. By now, you've seen the brutal punishment meted out to women in medieval Europe: torture, mutilation, and public humiliation, all to maintain a fragile system built on power, fear, and control. But here's the most disturbing part of it all. While women were subjected to the most gruesome punishments imaginable, men faced hardly any consequences at all. Let that sink in. The women who were branded, mutilated, drowned, or locked away for life, their suffering was supposed to be justice. But what about the men? The men who committed the very crime these women were accused of? They weren't branded. They weren't mutilated. They weren't even tortured. No. The punishment for men in most cases was so mild that it's almost unbelievable. If you were a man in medieval Europe and you were caught committing adultery, here's what you could expect: a fine, maybe some public penance, or at worst, a period of banishment from the town. That's it. You weren't dragged through the streets. You weren't mutilated. You didn't have to endure years of isolation in a tiny cell. You didn't face any of the horror women did. It was as if the very concept of justice didn't apply to men in the same way it did to women. In fact, the laws themselves were built to protect men from the very same punishment that women endured. In one of the most influential medieval law codes, the Saxon Spiegel, it explicitly stated that a man could only be punished for adultery if he was sleeping with another man's wife. But if he was unmarried or the woman was unmarried, it wasn't adultery at all. It was just fornication, which was a minor sin that could be easily atoned for. The double standard wasn't just a quirk of the system. It was built into the very fabric of medieval law. Men were protected by the law, given privileges that women could never access. For example, men were allowed to invoke trial by combat, a right that allowed them to fight their accuser in a duel. If they won, they were declared innocent. But women? Women were denied this right. No duel, no chance to prove their innocence through combat. They were condemned by the mere accusation. And let's talk about the hypocrisy of it all. The very men who judged these women, the priests, the judges, and the executioners, were often guilty of the same crimes they were condemning. In fact, historical records show that many of the men responsible for carrying out these brutal punishments were adulterers themselves. Some were caught having affairs, others kept mistresses, and many fathered illegitimate children. But guess what? They faced no consequences. They were able to carry on with their lives, untouched by the law, while women like Gertrude were publicly mutilated, ostracized, and left to die alone in the streets. The fact that these men could sit in judgment over women, knowing full well they were guilty of the same sins, reveals the sickening truth about the system. The punishment wasn't about fairness or justice. It was about control. It was about controlling women's bodies, controlling their sexuality, and ensuring that they were reminded of their place in society. But the hypocrisy doesn't stop there. Even when men were punished for their infidelity, the consequences were far less severe. In some cases, the worst punishment they would face was public penance, something as simple as wearing a sign or donating money to the church. And let's not forget the trial by combat, a privilege women could never have. In fact, in some regions, wealthy men could even hire a substitute to fight for them. So, if you were a nobleman accused of adultery, you could simply pay someone to take your place in the fight. For women, there was no escape, no substitute, no second chance. And here's the real kicker. In cases where a man's adultery was proven, he could pay a fine to avoid any real punishment. That was it. No mutilation, no public humiliation, no isolation, just a fine, and then he could go on with his life like nothing had ever happened. Meanwhile, women who were accused of the same crime were punished mercilessly, their names erased from history, their bodies mutilated, their lives destroyed. Now, you might be thinking, how could society have been this twisted? Well, it gets even worse. What if I told you that these barbaric practices didn't just end in the medieval period? No, some of these same systems, these same double standards, continued to shape history for centuries. Stay with me, because in the next part, I'll reveal how these ancient practices evolved and how their echoes can still be seen today. By now, you've witnessed the horrors of medieval justice, the mutilation, the public humiliation, the trial by ordeal, and the terrifying double standard that allowed men to get off scot-free while women endured unthinkable suffering. But what if I told you that these systems of control, these practices of shaming and punishing women, didn't just disappear in the Middle Ages? What if they didn't just fade away with the rise of modern civilization? The reality is far more disturbing. The truth is, these systems didn't just end, they evolved. The methods changed, the tools became less barbaric, but the underlying control remained the same. The patterns of gendered violence, the obsession with policing women's bodies, and the desire to make an example out of them. These elements didn't die with medieval law. They simply became more subtle, more hidden, but no less harmful. Take a look at modern society. You don't have to look far to see echoes of that same control. Women today still face public shaming for their sexual behavior, still bear the brunt of society's judgment when they step out of line. We call it slut shaming, but the truth is, it's the same mechanism at work, just rebranded for the modern age. Just like medieval times, when a woman's reputation could be destroyed by an accusation, today's women still find their lives ruined by rumors, social media posts, or the harsh judgment of the public. The punishment might not be mutilation or drowning, but the impact can be just as severe. Women who are accused of infidelity, or even just promiscuity, are still made to feel like outcasts, still treated as if their worth lies in their sexual purity, just like in the days of trial by ordeal. And let's not forget the double standards. Men still get away with so much. How often do you see a man's infidelity brushed off with a slap on the wrist, or at most, a public apology? While women, on the other hand, are expected to bear the full brunt of society's judgment. This dynamic continues to play out today, especially in how we view women's sexual agency. A man who sleeps around is a player or a stud, while a woman who does the same is slut-shamed and cast aside. But the legacy of medieval justice is even more insidious than that. The erasure of women, the stripping of their identities and agency, continues in different forms. Women who speak out against abuse, who challenge the status quo, or who defy societal expectations still face an invisible punishment, a social death. They're dismissed, silenced, and often treated as if their voices don't matter. In some ways, we've simply traded public executions and branding for social media cancel culture, but the effect is the same. Women are still marked, still targeted, still punished for not adhering to the role society has carved out for them. The cruelty isn't just physical, it's psychological, and it's woven into the very fabric of how we treat women across the world. So, as disturbing as it is to realize, the justice system we saw in medieval Europe isn't just a relic of the past. It's alive and well in the way we treat women today. We might not have public floggings or branded faces, but we still have the same need to control women, to silence them, to shame them. We still see the same violence, now cloaked in modern respectability. But the fight isn't over. The more we learn about this dark history, the more we can challenge it, push back against these patterns of control, and create a society where women's voices are heard, where their bodies are their own, and where justice isn't just another tool to punish, but a system that supports true equality. If this video shocked you, it should. But it's also a reminder that the struggle for justice and equality is far from over. Drop a comment below telling me what part of this history still shocks you the most. And subscribe now to Dark Empire Histories, because there are still many dark corners of the past we need to uncover. The truth is out there, and we're going to expose it.